hand straight over to Peter for his presentation, which is entitled Adapting Company Culture to the Aging Workforce. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be able to talk with you today about some work that I was asked to carry out on behalf of the UK government last year. And what I want to do over the next sort of 20 minutes is to tell you a little bit about why this was necessary, and to then show you some of the results of that study that I undertook, because I think it has important implications for employers, employees, those involved in occupational health, those involved in risk assessment, and generally those involved in human relations and workforce planning. So why are we concerned about this issue? Well, it's not just a personal thing that I'm starting to get on a bit. It actually is based on the fact that as a country, we have some fairly significant problems in terms of how we are going to tackle an aging population. So in my presentation today, I want to describe some of those problems and enable others to appreciate the scale of these problems. And indeed, I think there's a certain amount of confusion about whether or not we're going to be able to draw our pensions at the time that we thought we were. So the government asked me to undertake a study to try and really understand what goes on at a deeper level and what the evidence is that may enable us to keep people in work for longer. The aims of the review that I was asked to undertake were basically to consider what we might have to do in the workplace to enable larger number of people to successfully and productively remain in the workforce beyond our traditional retirement age in this country, which has been 65. Now, those retirement ages vary around the world and around Europe, but in this country, traditionally it's been 65, but it has already been extended to 66 and subsequently 67 for those entering the workforce at the moment, and it is likely to extend further. And also to consider the barriers that aging workers face and how they may be overcome within the short-term future. Obviously, to look at this across the whole of the working population was an immense task, so I chose to look at it across a number of work sectors. So those of you that work within manufacturing, construction, nursing or the care industries, those working with office or what we sometimes call knowledge workers, or those working in retail, these are all sectors that I did have a chance to review, along with seeing what was happening with respect to the management of older workers and also how we risk assess the work that older workers are doing. In order to do this review, I decided it was important to understand the evidence that there was to support and enable us to understand each of these issues. There's a lot of opinion, there's a lot of views of those that think they know, but what's the real evidence underpinning our current state of knowledge about older workers in the workforce? That was my main concern. So I looked to try and identify and review all those particularly design-based initiatives that people were undertaking to see if they could improve the workplace and the work system to accommodate older workers more easily. And I also spoke with a wide number of designers throughout the design community who are particularly interested in what they call future look research, which is trying to develop new ways of designing systems to help older workers and older people generally. Now, when I talk about the work system, I tend to use the models that are put forward by those that are ergonomics and human factors specialists. And that's important because, as you'll see in this slide, it's not just about the individual behavior in the middle and the physical devices that people might use, albeit that these are very important elements, but it goes much wider than that. So, for example, older people may be quite comfortable with using certain piece of equipment or technology if the environment is appropriate, if it's not too noisy, or if the lighting's good enough. If those are not adequate for older workers, then they'll struggle perhaps with some of the physical devices they're asked to use. Similarly, if you move up the slide, you'll see that I also tend to think about how older workers operate within teams and groups. Because if, for example, as we saw frequently when we were doing research in this area, we find older workers are working in teams where everyone else is much younger, that much younger team may find it frustrating that, for example, that the older person can't keep up with the pace of work they want to set, albeit at other times the younger team are heavily reliant on the experience and knowledge of the older worker. So understanding team and group behaviour is a very important part of the way that we approach these problems. Similarly, looking at how management and how work is organised and how management understand the older worker is an area which, as you'll see later, we are really not very good at the moment. And moving on from that, there's also the context in which this happens with respect to our regulations, the Equality Act, and indeed how society and culture view these issues. Do we want people to work till they're much older, and how does that older cohort of workers feel about working to that age? So what did we actually find? Well, what I found was that trying to predict who is going to be in the workforce in years to come across different sectors was exceptionally difficult. And in fact, predicting the workforce composition beyond a 10-year horizon is very difficult in most areas. We really don't know, for example, how the economic climate will impact on work and work patterns. We don't know how technology will influence particular sectors and industry. Very difficult indeed. And I was asked if I could see to 2040, and really there was very, very little hard evidence that anyone is doing workforce planning beyond a very short-term time horizon. And that creates challenges for designers who would obviously like to be designing for a long-term future. So what are the drivers that might determine what our work system infrastructure and what technological needs will be required for older workers? Well, one of the ones is obviously that how do we change as we get older? And we actually do have a good knowledge of aging processes that will enable the identification of some key factors that we will need to address in the future. But what I also found was that there's a tendency to overgeneralize regarding the needs of an older workforce. And what I mean by that is that all sectors within the workforce might well have very, very different needs in terms of what older workers will require. If you work in a very heavy physical sector, then it's clearly very different to those that are working perhaps in the knowledge economy, working in offices. Their needs and what we will have to do to accommodate older workers could be substantially different. The other thing I found was that we're, in terms of the hard evidence in the literature, work system interventions are often based on one workplace factor alone. So we might change some software, or we might change some furniture, we might change a piece of equipment. But that isn't really sufficient to demonstrate any real effect in terms of how older workers will perform over the long term. And that's because the work is a complex socio-technical system with many interrelated dependencies. What does that mean? Well, it means, I think, that if we change one thing in the system, it can have knock-ons elsewhere. So to make something easier or faster for someone can have adverse effects for them in other parts of their job or in other parts of the team that they're working in. So when we evaluate the interventions that people have tried to make older workers perform better, make less errors, have less health problems, it's often difficult to glean and to understand exactly what it has happened in that system to benefit them and where there may be disadvantages as well. It also became clear, as I stated earlier, that sector-specific policy is required because across different areas of work, then so the requirements can be significantly different. And this is particularly noticeable where technology is advancing very rapidly or where physical work demands remain high. So it may be very easy for older workers to work remotely because they have less physical strain in terms of, for example, travel. On the other hand, if they have to do a job where the physical requirements necessitate them being there for long hours, then the challenges remain very, very high in terms of improving the design. We do have some good research in some sectors, for example, the construction industry, health and social care, manufacturing. But in other areas, we have very, very little information indeed. And I think that presents a huge challenge for those that are asked to manage and work within those sectors. So let's just run through some of them. Manufacturing, well, we don't have a huge amount of research on the ageing workforce, or indeed how the demographic of that population might change. We do know that a third of this workforce are aged over 50, and almost half of those would prefer shorter hours than at present. And maybe that gives us a clue as to how we might start to manage an ageing workforce in manufacturing. The physical demands on older workers may well mean that they need to be managed differently in order to reduce their exposure to heavy physical loads, and that might be done by increased mechanisation and automation. Some companies are ahead of the game on this, and BMW in particular are a company that have used co-design, where they get the older employees to work with the company to try and improve the design of the workplace, workstations and so on. In the construction industry, again, we've got an ageing work population, and here the physical job demands and the psychosocial, the psychological, if you like, and the social characteristics do affect the ability and willingness to continue working until and after the age of 65. There is some good guidance available and there's some good research, but unfortunately I think we're still short of well-evaluated interventions that would enable us to make clear decisions about how to improve this sector. Nursing and care services is a huge challenge, I think, in probably all countries for many reasons, but the psychological and physical burden of work in this sector has always been well recognised, and certainly in the UK there's been a movement towards much longer shifts, up to 12-hour shifts for many workers. And for older workers in particular, we feel this represents a significant increase in risk to them in terms of physical and possibly even psychological, but certainly physical health concerns. And our risk assessment strategies are probably not sufficient to deal with this at the moment. We go on to the office-based worker. It's thought that we could actually do a great deal to enhance the workplace and the work system to enable people to work for much longer in this sector. And whilst that's probably true, there's again a paucity of evidence, too little evidence on how important such changes are, how they might ultimately affect the performance of the older worker in a good way, how desirable they are as seen by older workers, and how much they may influence the decisions of older workers regarding staying in the workforce for longer. I would like to think that if we design that sector in a way which enables workers to work perhaps remotely more often, to work with software that is designed for older workers, then I believe we can do a great deal to enhance the likelihood that people will stay in that workforce for longer. On the retail sector, there's been lots of attempts by stores in the UK, particularly DIY, home stores, those kind of places, to encourage older workers to be there to inform customers on how to do things and to have a much more interactive role with customers. And to some extent that seems to be working quite well, but there are still immense postural demands and postural requirements which we know can counteract that in many retail settings. That brings me to a few closing slides, the first of which is risk assessment. Most of the risk assessment in the UK and across Europe is based on the evidence we can glean from younger workers, and we really have very little idea of what is required to risk assess people as they go into their late 60s. Many workers at that age will have comorbidities, they'll have other illnesses which, whilst not work related specifically, may be aggravated or made worse by work, and we need to understand how we're going to manage that within the workplace. And when we look at the huge range in this circle here, you can see the huge range of physical, sensory and cognitive functions that might change with age, will change with age, then we need to decide how these need to be built into improved risk assessment. So if I give you one example of that, if we were to look at the strength of older workers, we know that strength starts to decline from about the 5th decade at a rate of about 10 to 15% until we reach our 80s. And that has huge implications for how we undertake risk assessments at the workplace and what we consider to be safe and reasonable. Management of older workers, we know that older workers are valued because of their knowledge, skills and experience, but we also know that managing an aging workforce requires additional training to maximise the potential and contribution of the older workers. And certainly in the UK, we feel that we have much to learn from other European countries on how to improve our age management within the workplace to ensure that older workers remain motivated, are seen as valuable and wish to stay there. So to summarise, age management skills certainly in the UK seem to not reflect the best practice across the European Union and perhaps globally. However, there are many countries I think that are in a similar position to the UK. When we look at things like new technology, we find that many older workers require additional training to maintain their performance, and it should not be assumed that older workers will gain new knowledge in the same way that younger workers do around technology, but nevertheless all older workers, we feel that are suitably motivated, will manage if the software and other technology is appropriately designed. There are very few studies that have actually evaluated the benefits of physical infrastructure design for older working age population, and that is clearly needed. But it is also obvious that were we to pay more attention to workplaces for older workers, including things like lighting levels, protected areas for individual concentration, reducing physical loads, that they will have performance and well-being benefits for older workers. In the future, I believe it's the evidence that I have reviewed suggests that older workers will still be considered valuable employees because of their knowledge, their skills and their experience. Enhancing workplaces for many issues that adversely impact on the older workforce is also likely to bring benefits to all workers, and I think that's a very, very important point, that if we get it right for older workers, it will almost certainly enhance the performance, the system effectiveness, quality of work and reduction of errors for all workers. And new designs of work systems, especially for older workers, I think can benefit hugely from taking on board the idea of co-designed participatory approaches where the workers themselves are involved in the design and redesign of workplaces. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties we had at the start. If you wish to get hold of a copy of the report and study it in more detail, then please email me at ergonomics@robbinsinstitute.com, and I'm more than happy to handle any questions that now arise. Thank you very much.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Peter. Quite an insight into the area, and as ever, a great deal of interesting material to sort of mull over. One thing that came out a bit frivolous, perhaps, but of worry to me, you were talking about the amount of strength reduction as we go through our decades, so to speak, and you said that our strength decreases until the 80s. Now, does it mean that we drop off the cliff at that stage, or is it just we haven't got the research data?
I think most of the data that I was looking at was I was restricting myself to data that might be relevant for the workforce, really. So as if you want to carry on working until your 90s, John, you're very welcome. But I think most people can speak.
Now, I take that as a very positive sign that you're not expecting us to work beyond 80. I'm not sure the government would agree with you at the moment, but we will see. And perhaps mentioning that does perhaps bring us to one of the questions, because I'm talking about what our government might think. There's a question as to, well, how well would these views, these results translate outside the UK? I'm guessing pretty similar, because
yeah, and certainly a lot of the evidence that I have relied on in terms of changes that occur as we age. That is research that has been done in many other countries. Finland particularly has been a leader in terms of looking at the ageing workforce, and has been looking at it for some sort of 15, 20 years, and have been sort of plotting trends in those things. So I think the evidence that are presented will be of interest across Europe and beyond, because the general messages about ageing are likely to resonate in most countries. So the thing that will differ in different countries, though, is the structure of the workforce in specific sectors, and therefore it may be that some countries need this information more urgently than others. Let's put it that way.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Another one, could aging workers have a right to part-time working in the future? That's an interesting thought.
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, clearly, if they have some sickness, morbidity, some health issues, then that would normally be accommodated, or is often accommodated through reduced work hours, which are normally negotiated with each company. I can't answer that. I think more than to say that in the future it would be highly desirable, because it's something we find when we interview older workers, that many older workers do want to carry on working but do not want to work full time. And I think understanding employers who see the benefits of having the skills and knowledge that older workers have will rapidly come to realise that if they can be flexible with the way older workers work, then that would be sensible. We also know that in some sectors that's very difficult to achieve, simply because of the nature of the work and the importance of people being there together all the time. So I would like to see that we certainly develop that. Whether or not it'll ever become a right, I'm afraid I can't really predict.
Yes, yeah. But in that, you're talking about accommodating for the older workforce, and someone here has asked, however, this is likely to involve significant cost, and do we have any sort of idea, any results of the costs of adapting the workforce, or the work environment for the ageing workforce?
Well, I think the significant cost can only be assessed with regard to significant benefits. And when we start to pursue that, I think we rapidly find that were we to make adjustments to, let us say, the lighting levels in a particular workplace, we'd probably find that everyone benefited from that, and therefore, let us say, the number of errors was reduced, the quality of the work we carried out there was increased. You might well find that for a very modest investment, you actually see significant benefits, and certainly within the world of human factors and ergonomics, we often find that. And what we tend to see is that if you make improvements for an older workforce, and that may be your motivation, you do see these benefits for all the other people working there as well. So increasing mechanisation can often enhance the life of everyone working there, improve the efficiency of it, reduce the amount of sickness, and so on. So I think, yes, there may be costs involved, but I think if you are going to make that investment, then like anything else, you would want to look at the return on investment. And I believe there's quite a lot of evidence out there that says that the return on investment might mean that it's a very, very sensible place to invest for your workforce of the future. The other thing that's worth saying is that repeatedly in the literature, when you read it, you realise that if you lose an older worker, you are losing a huge amount of knowledge and experience, which is almost impossible to replace. And that isn't the knowledge that's written down in your standard operating procedures or your guide to how to do a job. It's all that knowledge that is stored over many years as to how to communicate with people, who to go to fix things, what happens when this particular scenario arises, which perhaps doesn't happen very often, but your older workers have that knowledge. So investing in those older workers is, in many cases, a very, very important thing to do.
Indeed so. I'm trying to keep up with the questions now, but there are flooding. Yes. And I'm not sure. Well, I'm pretty sure we won't have time to go through them all. But an engineer has asked here, are there any data charts such as those we have for anthropometrics and so forth, but related to the strength of workers? And he, as working in a civil engineering area, is obviously interested in on the risk, I guess, that he's putting his workforce, his aging workforce to.
Yes, there are. There are data around specific strength capacities, and I think that the difficulty sometimes is in applying those directly to any given situation. So the Health and Safety Executive in the UK have good data on strength capabilities, and most ergonomics consultants would be able to help with that. But as I say, the difficulty is often applying what's in the tables to any specific task that is being undertaken. So my advice would be to actually seek the advice of experts in the human factors ergonomics area, because directly applying some of the guidance may not actually give you the right result.
Okay, indeed so. Okay. How is this report being communicated to business? Yes.
Well, that's a good question. It was communicated through a number of sort of dissemination seminars, and it is my understanding that the key messages will form part of a policy document. But that was something that was discussed about 1 year ago, and I've not seen further evidence of it emerging. So it may well be that were industry to prompt, some of these things may be more forthcoming.
So we want our listeners to have a go and chivvy up the Office for Science, the Government Office for Science. Yeah. Another one, I think they might have to make this one pretty much the last one, but is it thought that ageing workers may need specific assessments such as those that we undertake at the moment for pregnant workers and so forth?
Well, I would prefer to see that the current risk assessments that are out there are put out by the Health and Safety Executive and are available for anyone to use, that they were adapted to be more inclusive of an older population. In the same way that some modifications are made for younger workers, it may well be that we need to see sort of an addendum to the current risk assessments to see how risks might change when we look at those over the age of 65. And that's quite a challenge, but at the same time I do believe the HSE are considering how best to extrapolate, as it were, their current risk assessment to accommodate those over that age. Whether that's happening across Europe as a whole, I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I mean, certainly, yeah, there are a lot of moves in this country on the six-pack at the moment in terms of revising them, and I think there's probably some issues that need to be brought out in the guidance that's that we're yet to see in those. But okay, well, Peter, I think we'll probably have to stop the questions now because we are going to run short of time. But I understand you're quite happy to answer these, and we'll put the ones that remain, and we'll put these online with a copy of the presentation. Would you be okay with that?
That's absolutely fine. And if anyone wants to email directly to ergonomics@rodensinstitute.com, I can provide further information about the report as well.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that. So if I can just thank you again, Peter, for your presentation. And thank everybody listening for taking the time to join us. Obviously, we hope you come back for our next webinar, which will be a little earlier in the month, next month in July. It's going to be on the 1st of July due to the availability of the presenter. The subject I've got here is The Future is Wellbeing, Health and Safety, and it's to be presented by Sarah Piddington. So I hope you found today's talk interesting. Certainly the number of questions suggests that you did. And all that really remains for me is to thank you all for listening and to wish you a very good afternoon and a good weekend. And thank you and goodbye.